Joining me now to discuss the ideas behind his new piece titled A Foreign Policy for the World as It Is Ben Rhodes. He's the former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama, an MSNBC political contributor, and the author of the book After the Fall, The Rise of Authoritarianism and the World We've Made. And Ben's story is the cover story on the current issue of Foreign Affairs. Ben, good to see you. Thank you for joining us this morning. I want to just read a passage from your article in which you say, meeting the moment requires abandoning a mindset of American primacy and recognizing that the world will be a turbulent place for years to come. Above all, it requires building a bridge to the future, not the past, which is a through line that runs through your story, that the future is not what we are used to. It's not what policymaking in Washington has been accustomed to. What does that mean in practical terms?
Well, I think the United States sometimes, because of its muscle memory, still acts as if we have the degree of power and influence that we had in the world in, say, the 90s or the immediate post 9/11 era, when we essentially called the shots. And now we're living in a world where America's standing has been diminished for a lot of reasons, Ali, from the Iraq War to the financial crisis to the election of Donald Trump and the first Trump presidency. But also because Russia is committed to tearing down the world order. China is committed to building an alternative world order. And we can't go around the world and kind of dictate outcomes. And this is that clinging to primacy, that clinging to the idea that we can call the shots and dictate exactly how things are going to play out. Well, there's a lot in the world that is pushing back against that impulse, including a war in Ukraine, a war in the Middle East, and some fault lines between the United States and China and Asia. And the last thing I think any of us want is this kind of drift that we've been in towards kind of global conflagration. And I think the more America tries to insist that all these issues have to go entirely how we want them to be, paradoxically, the less likely we are to make progress and the more likely we are to get into conflict. Because if you have a zero-sum view and you're matching that against a bunch of other zero-sum views, a bunch of nationalist countries duking it out, that leads to war. That's what history tells us.
How would you characterize for a voter the distinctions between Joe Biden and Donald Trump as it relates to your conversation here, your very detailed conversation about a new foreign policy for America? What would you say you're making a choice between? Because as you and I know, we both love global affairs, but it's not typically the thing a voter decides on.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd say these things do matter because take a look around the world. These are real wars. These are the largest land war in Europe since World War II,
yep.
A major conflict that could escalate more in the Middle East, and a conflict in China with China that could dwarf them all. So we're back in the kind of Cold War days, Ali, where this should matter as a voting issue because if things go wrong, they can go wrong very badly. In terms of the choice, I think, look, Donald Trump, let's be blunt. He's not respected. He's not taken seriously around the world. He's a chaos agent. He's incapable of working with other countries to solve problems. One of the points I make in the article, Ali, is that Donald Trump's erratic trade war with China contributed significantly to the inflation that we've been feeling in our country. That never gets discussed. Donald Trump's tearing up agreements contributed, I believe, directly to October 7th. Between Israel and Hamas. And so Donald Trump's not going to solve these problems, and he's going to make them worse. And you're taking a chance on a volatile strongman sharing the stage globally with a bunch of other volatile strongmen, and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and Narendra Modi. I don't think that's a recipe for solving any problems here. So if Trump offers kind of chaos and risk, I think Joe Biden at least offers, again, the predictability of an America that is functioning in line with a set of allies, functioning in line with a set of familiar interests to the United States. I would like to see Biden kind of abandon what we've seen, for instance, in Gaza, where we're kind of going through the motions of how we used to do things. You know, we have to hug Israel. We have to sign on to a maximalist objective of destroying Hamas that is not achievable. That's gotten us into trouble. So where I think Biden needs to go is he needs to kind of let go of some of these presumptions that we can shape things in the way we once did 20 or 30 years ago.
Let's just zero in on that issue of Israel and Gaza. There are some people who have said they will not vote for Joe Biden or they will withhold their vote. They may not vote against him. They may not vote for Donald Trump as a result of the bear hug of Israel. Is there something, and I'm sure the administration is working very hard to try and get the ceasefire deal that seems remarkably elusive, but is there a world in which that deal can be good enough to convince people that Biden can be in the right place on this and that you shouldn't withhold your vote because the chaos of having Donald Trump as president is not going to look better for anybody as it relates to the Middle East?
First of all, as someone who's been quite critical, as you know, Ali, of their Gaza policy, I do have to say to people here, elections are not about perfect outcomes. They're about choices. Donald Trump would be far more damaging. Donald Trump would embrace, I think, the Israeli right wing's goal of literally annexing the West Bank. There would be no effort to get assistance into people in Gaza. So one point I'd make is just the choice is very stark, even with the dissatisfaction that many people, including myself, feel over Gaza. I think what's incumbent on the administration is to recognize that good politics is not whether or not you embrace the Israeli prime minister. Good politics is good policy outcomes. And the full embrace of the most far-right government in Israel's history has not led to good policy outcomes. It's contributed to a kind of a sense of impunity that the Israeli government feels that they don't need to have a plan for Gaza, that they can have this absurd objective of destroying Hamas, which is not achievable. A lot of Hamas's leadership isn't even in Gaza, never mind capable of being destroyed through the kind of military operation we've seen. So I'd like to see them be more straightforward with people about what they're trying to achieve. Instead of telling us about an Israeli proposal for a ceasefire that the Israeli prime minister himself can say he agrees with, let's lay out, okay, here's what our objective is. And if we don't see the Israeli government moving in line with that objective, we don't need to ship them offensive military weapons. That is essential for the maintenance of what they're doing. And so I do think that people want policy outcomes as much as they want to see political messaging on this.
I just came back from Central Asia, where it was amazing to see, whether you like it or not, the economic influence, which turns into political influence, that China has over these post-Soviet parts of the world. And it really causes us to have a discussion in America about whether China is ally or adversary or somewhere in between, and what our strategy going forth looks like. As you said, Trump had some interesting ideas about China, but he was so ham-fisted and just uncoordinated about it that it never emerged into anything meaningful. I worry about that all the time, that the average American doesn't know what to think about China and our future.
I think the average American wants to make sure that China's not ripping us off, stealing our intellectual property, breaking trade rules. But I think the average American knows that we have to coexist with China. They're going to be a big, powerful, rich country, whether we like it or not. And the last thing that the world wants and that Americans want is an out-and-out conflict with China. And Ali, I think we've overcorrected in this country. We went from a policy of engagement with China, trying to work things out, to a huge pendulum swing towards confrontation, not just under Trump, but also under Biden. Tariffs, export controls, restricting investment, restricting technology, geopolitical competition. I think some of that was definitely necessary, some of that correction. But I think we've now overcorrected because we're not going to, quote unquote, defeat China. They're going to get advanced technologies. They need to be a part of the climate solution. They need to be a part of the regulation of artificial intelligence. And we need to be talking to them if we want to avoid a war in Taiwan. And so I think we have to shift from the kind of confrontational mode that we've been in to one of competitive coexistence here, where there's a negotiation as well as a competition taking place.
Ben, let me ask you one other question. For those who don't concern themselves too much with foreign policy, who are mostly concerned with domestic policy, there is an argument to be made here when you look into history at those countries that destroyed themselves domestically, and that had an influence on the world. And I think about Germany in the 1930s. Domestic policy influences foreign policy. The two are completely intertwined. They're not separate thoughts, and we probably have to stop thinking about them as separate thoughts.
Yeah, completely. I'd say for people who don't care about foreign policy, I'd say, look, not only should we be worried about wars, but the climate crisis, migration, technology, all these things are inherently tied to what happens around the world. But importantly, to people who work on foreign policy, they need to realize that politics really matters. Foreign policy is an extension of politics. You get the foreign policy from a country based on what's happening politically inside of it. And so the most important thing the United States can do for global democracy and stability is to be more democratic and stable at home. We're getting kind of in the world a reflection of what's happening in all of our respective countries. So the number one thing I say at the end of this piece is the number one thing America can do is detoxify its own democracy. That's going to reverberate on the world more than any foreign policy could.
100% right. As I travel the world, and the same thing with you, all you hear about is people's concerns are greater about American stability than their own countries and their own politics. If we were just stable and we could just look like we had a reasonable future, that alone might add to global stability. What a great article. I really recommend everybody read it. It's a cover story in Foreign Affairs magazine. Ben, thanks very much for joining us. As always, pleasure to see you. Ben Rhodes joining us on, he's a former Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. He's the co-host of the remarkable Pod Save the World podcast and the author of After the Fall, The Rise of Authoritarianism in the World We've Made.